A light rain began to fall, turning the asphalt into a dull mirror of the gray sky above. Walter Grayson, a man whose wealth was as vast as the emptiness in his soul, drove slowly along a deserted road in rural Vermont. The soft hum of classical music on the radio was little more than background noise as he stared blankly at the endless stretch ahead. Life for Walter had been on autopilot since the death of his wife, Evelyn. Everything he did now was just maintenance of his properties, his investments, and the polished image of a man who supposedly had it all. Then, as he rounded a curve, his headlights illuminated something that made his heart skip. Walter slammed on the brakes, the car screeching and skidding before coming to a jolting stop. His pulse raced, though not from the near accident. Lying motionless in the middle of the road was a horse. Its large frame was slumped on the wet pavement, its chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Walter gripped the steering wheel tightly, frozen in his seat. Something about the sight was heavier than it should have been, pressing on his chest like an invisible weight. He had no reason to care, so why did he? Pushing the car door open, Walter stepped into the damp air, the rain quickly soaking through his expensive suit. His footsteps felt unnaturally loud against the eerie stillness of the empty road. As he approached, the scent of wet earth and sweat hit him first, followed by the faint, strained sound of the horse's breathing. Kneeling beside the animal, Walter's knees sank into the wet ground, but he barely noticed. The horse's eyes slowly fluttered open, meeting Walter's gaze with a weariness so profound it was almost human. Walter swallowed hard. That look, hollow, exhausted, felt like looking into a mirror. "You're alone, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain that now fell harder. His words felt strange, like they weren't meant for the horse but for himself. Glancing around, he searched the roadside for some sign of help. A trailer, a car, anyone who might have lost this animal. But there was no one. Just him, the horse, and the sound of the rain pounding against the asphalt. His mind wavered, torn between leaving and staying, but the pull to act was undeniable. Then, the horse shifted its head ever so slightly toward him. A weak gesture, but one that sent a jolt through Walter's chest. "All right," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I won't leave you here." He didn't know what he could do or how to help, but in that moment, a decision was made. Little did Walter know, this encounter wasn't just about saving the horse. It was the beginning of a journey that would reshape his own life forever. Enjoyed the start of this emotional journey? Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming chapters. This story is just getting started, and what's ahead will leave you speechless. Thank you for watching. Walter stood in the middle of the empty road, rain soaking through his clothes as he stared at the horse lying before him. He had made the decision to help, but now, reality began to sink in. What exactly could he do? The horse was enormous, its breathing shallow and uneven, and Walter was a 67-year-old man with no idea how to handle an animal like this. For a fleeting moment, he considered getting back into his car and driving away. After all, wasn't that easier? But as he turned his head, the sight of those tired, pleading eyes stopped him in his tracks. "This is insane," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his soaked silver hair. He reached into his car for his phone, scrolling through his contacts aimlessly. Who could he even call? A vet? Animal control? The truth was, Walter didn't know anyone personally who could help. His life was a collection of business acquaintances and financial advisors, none of whom would be useful in this situation. He was utterly alone in figuring this out. Sighing heavily, he glanced back at the horse. "All right, buddy. We'll figure this out." Walter opened his trunk, grabbing a blanket that he usually kept for emergencies. Carefully, he approached the horse again, crouching beside it. The animal flinched slightly but didn't resist. Up close, Walter could see scratches along its legs and a thin coat of mud clinging to its sides. He draped the blanket over its body, shielding it from the rain as best he could. The small act of care made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. For so long, his days had been meaningless repetitions, but now, here he was, trying to save a life. The horse let out a soft, low sound, almost like a groan, and Walter froze. Was it in pain? Dying? His chest tightened at the thought. "Hang in there," he said quietly, unsure if the words were meant for the horse or for himself. He knew he couldn't move the animal alone, but leaving it wasn't an option anymore. Pulling his coat tighter against the rain, he walked back to his car, trying to calm the storm of uncertainty raging in his head. He searched for a signal on his phone and dialed the number for the nearest vet clinic he could find. The line rang, and an automated voice answered, "Thank you for calling Green Valley Veterinary. Our office hours are 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Please leave a message." Walter hung up in frustration, staring at the phone as if it had betrayed him. Looking back at the horse, he felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. The rain poured harder, and the road stretched endlessly in both directions. Walter stood there, soaked and uncertain, as a single thought began to grow louder in his mind. "What if I can't save it?" Walter paced along the side of the road, his breath fogging in the cold air as the rain drenched him to the bone. The horse lay unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of its chest, and Walter couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The gnawing question, "What if I can't save it?" had latched onto his thoughts, but he knew standing there wouldn't change anything. He clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You've built an empire, Walter," he muttered to himself. "You've fixed impossible problems. You can fix this." He looked up and down the road, hoping for headlights to appear, for someone to pull over and offer help. But the stretch of highway remained empty, shrouded in mist and rain. His gaze fell on the horse again, and a surge of determination cut through his doubt. "No one's coming," he said under his breath. If this animal was going to survive, it was on him. Walter opened the car door and grabbed a length of rope from the trunk, a relic from an old camping trip he'd forgotten about until now. He didn't know how to tie it properly, but it didn't matter. He just had to try. Approaching the horse again, Walter crouched low and hesitated for a moment. The animal's eyes were half closed, its exhaustion palpable, but it didn't resist as he looped the rope gently around its chest. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice softer than he expected. Every knot he tied felt clumsy and amateurish, but it was the best he could manage. Once the rope was secure, Walter stood and took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "All right," he whispered, gripping the rope tightly. "We're getting out of here." Walter returned to the car and started the engine, pulling forward just enough for the rope to tighten. As the slack disappeared, the horse let out a low, distressed sound, and Walter's heart sank. He leaned out of the driver's side window. "I know it hurts," he called out, "but you've got to work with me here." He pressed the gas pedal gently, the car inching forward, and to his amazement, the horse began to stir. Slowly, shakily, it tried to push itself upright, its legs trembling beneath its weight. Walter felt a rush of hope surge through him. This might actually work. But just as the horse rose to its knees, it stumbled and fell back onto the wet pavement with a heavy thud. Walter slammed on the brakes, his stomach churning with panic. He ran back to the animal, dropping to his knees beside it. The horse's breathing was even more labored now, and Walter could feel its exhaustion radiating like a physical force. "Come on," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You can't give up now." His hand rested on the horse's neck, its warmth grounding him in the cold, miserable rain. For a moment, the billionaire businessman felt utterly powerless, and he realized, saving this horse was no longer just about the animal. It was about saving a piece of himself. The storm was relentless now, the rain falling in sheets that blurred Walter's vision as he stood over the horse, his breath ragged and shallow. His soaked suit clung to him like a second skin, but he didn't care. Every fiber of his being was focused on the animal before him, whose breaths were growing weaker by the minute. He ran his hand over its neck again, feeling the coarse, wet hair beneath his trembling fingers. "You're not done," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince the horse or himself. Just then, the faint glow of headlights pierced through the fog. Walter spun around, hope flaring in his chest as a truck emerged from the rain, slowing as it approached. It was a rusted old pickup, its engine rumbling loudly as it came to a stop a few yards away. A man stepped out, dressed in a heavy coat and worn boots, his wide-brimmed hat shielding him from the downpour. "You all right, mister?" the man called out, his voice thick with a rural accent. Walter waved him over urgently, his heart pounding. "I need help," he shouted back. "This horse, he's hurt. I can't move him on my own." The man hurried over, his boots splashing in puddles as he approached the scene. He crouched beside the horse, his face lined with years of hard work and experience. "He's in bad shape," the stranger said, his tone grim but steady. "But he's still got some fight in him. You're lucky I came along. I've got a trailer not far from here." Walter exhaled sharply, relief washing over him like a wave. For the first time since he'd stopped his car, the crushing weight of helplessness began to lift. Within minutes, the man returned with his trailer, and together, they worked to coax the horse inside. It wasn't easy. The animal was weak, and every step seemed like a monumental effort. Walter's muscles burned as he pulled on the rope, his expensive shoes slipping in the mud, but he didn't stop. Not until the horse was finally inside, collapsing onto the straw-covered floor of the trailer. Walter leaned against the side, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "Thank you," he said to the stranger, his voice thick with exhaustion. The man nodded, tipping his hat. "We're not out of the woods yet," he replied. "But you did good." As the trailer door slammed shut, Walter climbed into the passenger seat of the truck, his hands still shaking. The stranger started the engine, and they began the slow journey to the nearest vet clinic. Walter stared out the window, the rain streaking down the glass. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of purpose. He didn't know why this horse had crossed his path, but he was starting to believe it wasn't just a coincidence. The truck rumbled down the narrow, rain-slicked road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Walter sat in the passenger seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His heart was pounding, not from the cold, but from the weight of uncertainty that loomed over him. Every few minutes, he glanced over his shoulder at the horse lying motionless in the trailer. The rhythmic sway of the vehicle didn't seem to bother the animal. It was either too weak or too resigned to react. "You think he's going to make it?" Walter asked quietly, his voice strained. The driver, who'd introduced himself as Hank, kept his eyes on the road. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, but his expression was unreadable. "Hard to say," Hank replied after a long pause. "He's in bad shape, no doubt about that. But horses are tougher than you'd think. Sometimes they surprise you." The words didn't offer much comfort, but Walter clung to them nonetheless. The idea that the horse might have some hidden strength left mirrored something deep inside him, something he wasn't ready to confront yet. As they pulled into the gravel driveway of a small veterinary clinic, a single light glowed above the entrance, casting a faint yellow halo in the stormy night. Hank parked the truck and cut the engine. "We'll get him inside," he said, pulling his coat tighter as he stepped out into the rain. Walter followed, his breath clouding the air as they hurried to the back of the trailer. When Hank opened the door, Walter felt his stomach tighten. The horse was still breathing, but barely. Its sides heaved with each labored breath, and its eyes were half closed, unfocused. Inside the clinic, a middle-aged veterinarian named Dr. Reed was already waiting, her face a mixture of professionalism and concern. "Let's get him on the lift," she said, directing them with brisk efficiency. Walter and Hank helped guide the horse as gently as they could, their combined effort barely enough to maneuver the massive animal. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and sterile, as they moved him into the examination room. Walter watched in silence as Dr. Reed began her work, her hands moving quickly but carefully. She injected something into the horse's neck and turned to Walter. "He's dehydrated and exhausted," she said. "But there's no sign of broken bones. That's the good news. The bad news is, it's going to take a lot of care to pull him through this." Walter nodded, his throat tight. "Do whatever it takes," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a credit card without hesitation. "I don't care what it costs. Just save him." Dr. Reed glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "I'll do everything I can," she replied, her tone steady but compassionate. As she turned back to the horse, Walter stepped aside, leaning against the wall. His mind was spinning. He didn't know why saving this animal felt so important, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing that mattered. Such an emotional scene. Walter's determination to save the horse is so powerful, and the tension in the stormy night makes it even more gripping. Can't wait to see what happens next. Walter sat on a cold metal chair in the corner of the clinic's waiting room, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped together tightly. The storm outside showed no signs of easing, and the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows added to the heaviness in the air. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, the sterile brightness contrasting with the emotional fog that clouded his mind. He stared at the door to the examination room, half expecting Dr. Reed to emerge with bad news. For the first time in years, he found himself praying, though he wasn't even sure who or what he was praying to. Hank had left after helping get the horse inside, tipping his hat and offering a reassuring, "He's in good hands now." But Walter barely acknowledged him, too consumed by the weight of the moment. Now, sitting alone, he couldn't stop the memories from creeping in. Evelyn's laughter echoed faintly in his mind, her voice a balm to the emptiness that had overtaken him since her passing. He thought of the times she'd begged him to slow down, to enjoy the simple things in life, to make room for something other than work. Walter had always brushed her off. There'd be time for all of that later, he'd told her. But later had never come. The creak of a door snapped him back to the present. Dr. Reed stepped into the waiting room, wiping her hands on a towel. Walter shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "How is he asked, his voice taut with a mix of hope and fear. Dr. Reed sighed, crossing her arms. "He's stable for now," she said. "We've got him on fluids and a painkiller to keep him comfortable. He's severely dehydrated and malnourished, but he's a fighter. If he can make it through the next 24 hours, his chances improve significantly." Walter exhaled sharply, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Dr. Reed studied him for a moment, as if trying to understand why a man in an expensive suit seemed so invested in a stray horse. "Do you have any idea where he came from? A nearby farm, maybe?" she asked. Walter shook his head. "I found him on the road. That's all I know." He hesitated, then added, "But I'm not leaving until I know he's okay." She nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "All right. Let me know if you need anything. I'll keep an eye on him overnight." As she disappeared back into the exam room, Walter sank into the chair again, his exhaustion catching up with him. But even as his body ached and his clothes clung to him uncomfortably, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a faint flicker of purpose. Saving this horse had started as an impulse, but now it felt like the first meaningful thing he'd done in a long time. He closed his eyes, the hum of the clinic and the distant rain blending into a lullaby, and for the first time in ages, he didn't feel completely alone. The morning sunlight streamed through the clinic's windows, casting a warm glow on the otherwise sterile room. Walter hadn't realized he'd dozed off in the waiting chair until the sound of footsteps approaching jarred him awake. His body ached from the awkward position, but he straightened immediately as Dr. Reed entered the room. She looked tired but calm, her expression giving little away. Walter's heart thudded in his chest as he stood to meet her. "He made it through the night," Dr. Reed said, offering a small but genuine smile. Walter's shoulders slumped with relief, the tension he'd been holding since the previous evening finally releasing. "He's not out of the woods yet," she continued, "but he's responding well to the fluids and showing signs of regaining strength. He's tougher than he looks." For the first time in what felt like forever, Walter allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice laden with gratitude. Dr. Reed nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "When we cleaned him up, we noticed something unusual." Walter's brow furrowed as she motioned for him to follow her back into the exam room. Inside, the horse lay on a thick bed of hay, its breathing slow but steady. Walter's gaze softened as he approached, but then he saw it, a faint brand on the horse's flank, partially obscured by dirt and scars. "It's an old ranch brand," Dr. Reed explained, crouching to examine it. "Not common around here. It looks like he may have come from somewhere farther out west. Texas, maybe. It's faint, which means he's likely been away from wherever he came from for a long time." Walter stared at the mark, a strange unease settling over him. Who had owned this horse? Why had it ended up alone on a desolate Vermont road, so far from where it seemed to belong? The questions churned in his mind, and with them came a nagging sense that this encounter wasn't as random as it seemed. Dr. Reed glanced up at Walter, breaking the silence. "If you're serious about helping him, I'd suggest trying to trace his origin. That mark could lead us to someone who knows his story, or at least explain how he ended up here." Walter nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. Something about this horse had drawn him in from the moment he saw it, and now it felt like there was more to uncover. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. As he stood beside the horse, resting a hand gently on its neck, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that this journey had only just begun. Walter drove back to his estate later that morning, the road ahead shimmering with puddles left by the previous night's storm. His mind was restless, replaying Dr. Reed's words over and over. That faint ranch brand had stirred something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, but also a lingering unease. Who had left the horse in such a state? Why had it traveled so far, and why now, at this point in Walter's life? He couldn't dismiss the nagging thought that this wasn't just a random encounter. Arriving home, Walter parked his car in the circular driveway and stepped out, the enormity of his empty mansion looming before him. It had been years since this house had felt like a home. Evelyn's touch had faded with time, leaving only cold, lifeless spaces in its place. But today, Walter didn't dwell on the silence. Instead, he walked directly to his study, where he flipped open his laptop and began his search. He didn't know much about horses, but he figured the brand might lead him somewhere. Hours passed as he scoured forums, databases, and ranch registries, his frustration growing with each dead end. He nearly gave up when one small detail caught his eye. A ranch in West Texas had once used a similar brand, though it hadn't been operational for decades. Walter leaned closer to the screen, his pulse quickening. The ranch, according to an archived article, had been part of a sprawling property called Willow Creek Farms. It had been sold years ago, but whispers of financial trouble and legal disputes surrounded its history. Something about the name struck him, though he couldn't place why. Walter dialed Dr. Reed's clinic and asked her to email a photograph of the horse's brand. When the picture arrived, he compared it to the archived image from the article. It wasn't an exact match, but it was close enough to make his chest tighten. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the faint mark on the horse's flank. The mysteries surrounding the ranch deepened his resolve. "This is it," he muttered to himself. "This is where he came from." Later that evening, as Walter sat alone in his study, the weight of his decision began to sink in. If he wanted answers, he'd have to dig deeper, possibly even visit Texas himself. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. For years, he'd been trapped in the monotony of his life, going through the motions with no real direction. But now, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, this horse and its past had reignited something in him. As he sipped his whiskey and gazed out at the darkened horizon, he felt it clearly. This wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about finding something he'd lost within himself. The plane descended over the dry, sprawling landscape of West Texas, the endless horizon painted in hues of amber and gold. Walter stared out the window, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He hadn't been this far from home in years, and certainly not for something so uncertain. Yet here he was, flying across the country to chase the ghost of a story, one etched faintly on the flank of a horse who had stumbled into his life. Part of him wondered if he'd lost his mind, but another part, a part long buried, felt alive again. Stepping out of the rental car hours later, Walter was greeted by the sight of what remained of Willow Creek Farms. The once grand property was now little more than a skeleton of its former self. The barn's roof sagged, the fences leaned precariously, and the fields were overgrown with weeds. The air was hot and dry, carrying the faint scent of dust and hay. Walter hesitated, the stillness of the place weighing on him. It was as though time had abandoned this land, leaving behind only whispers of its past. He approached the farmhouse cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. A weathered for sale sign leaned against the front porch, faded and forgotten. Walter knocked on the door, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Finally, it creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a sharp gaze and a face lined by decades of sun and hardship. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice gruff but curious. Walter introduced himself, explaining the situation in brief: the horse, the brand, and his desperate need for answers. The man, who introduced himself as Clyde, listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Walter showed him the photo of the brand, Clyde's demeanor shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "That's one of ours," he said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "That horse came from this ranch, no doubt about it. But if he's out there now, well, someone must have wanted him gone. That horse carries more history than you realize, son." Walter leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What history?" Clyde hesitated, as though weighing whether to tell him. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Willow Creek had its fair share of secrets," he began. "The kind that tore families apart and left scars deeper than you can see. If that horse found its way to you, maybe it's time for those secrets to come to light." As Clyde's words hung in the air, Walter felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. He'd come looking for answers, but it seemed he was about to uncover far more than he bargained for. The sun dipped low over Willow Creek Farms, casting long shadows across the crumbling property. Sitting on the porch, Clyde recounted the ranch's troubled past. The horse, he explained, was part of a prized bloodline meant to rebuild the ranch's legacy. But betrayal had shattered the family. "That horse wasn't just an animal," Clyde said. "It was hope. When it was sold off, everything fell apart." Walter sat in silence, the weight of the story settling over him. The horse had endured years of neglect, just like the abandoned dreams tied to this place. "Do you think he was trying to come back?" Walter asked hesitantly. Clyde chuckled softly. "I don't know about that," he replied, "but I do know you didn't find him by chance. Maybe he needed you as much as you needed him." The words hit Walter harder than he expected. 4 years, he'd buried his pain in work, isolating himself from the world. But the horse had given him something to hold on to, a purpose he hadn't felt since Evelyn was alive. Back in Vermont a few days later, Walter stood in the stable he'd renovated in record time. The horse, now recovering, rested in a fresh stall, its coat clean and its strength slowly returning. Walter leaned against the gate, watching the animal with quiet admiration. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured. The horse turned its head, nudging his hand gently. For the first time in years, Walter smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. The stable was quiet, save for the soft rustling of hay. Walter felt something inside him shift, as if the weight he'd carried for so long was finally lifting. Saving this horse had started as an act of impulse, but it had become something far greater. In helping the horse heal, Walter had begun to heal himself. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air brushed against his face. The journey wasn't over, not for him or the horse, but for the first time in years, Walter felt ready to face it. The horse hadn't just stumbled into his life. It had reminded him that, even after loss, there's always a chance to rebuild. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and emotional narratives like this one. Your support means so much and helps bring more stories that touch the heart. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.